Welcome, welcome to another episode of The Shaman's Wife. I hope you're enjoying this mini-series with my dear friend Alicia. And of course, if you want to find out more about Alicia, or more about me, or more about the Heads Together podcast, go to the show notes. There will be all the links you need. And if you haven't already, I urge you to pre-order your copy, or if you're listening to this when the book has now been published, order your copy of The Shaman's Wife. This is a transformational book, and I'm so honored to have Alicia with me for this mini-series where we are diving into the background to this powerful memoir. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Heads Together podcast. I'm Jill Mokes, and I am obsessed with cutting through the noise when it comes to growing your business. Each week, via intimate coaching conversations and inspirational stories, I share what it really takes to get the results you want in a way that feels right to you. I am all about attracting higher ticket opportunities, building authentic relationships, and creating the abundant, full-fat version of your dream business. I mean, how many of us have beavered away creating a light version of what we really want? The thing is, I honestly believe when you're outstanding at what you do, there is no limit to what you can achieve. So, are you ready to put our heads together and make it happen? Let's go. Hey, Alicia, welcome back. Episode 6, can you believe?
I can't believe it. We've gone through this far and we've got one more to go after this. So pretty exciting.
I know. Very, very exciting. Yeah. And actually, so we've got another episode of our mini-series after this, but then we are doing a special live. So keep your ears peeled for that. Ears peeled? Do we peel our ears? That makes no sense.
We keep our eyes peeled, I think. Ears open, eyes.
Keep your eyes peeled and your ears open. Alicia, today we're going to be talking about spiritual practice. And I'd really love us to kick off, please, with you telling us a little bit about the role of spirituality in this book, how you see that.
Yeah. Actually, it's kind of fundamental to the book because my feeling is that even as a child, I've always been on a spiritual quest. I grew up Catholic and I went to Catholic school with Dominican nuns. And one of the memories I have is they used to take us to chapel every day. And in that chapel, and probably many other churches and chapels as well, the Stations of the Cross, if you're Catholic, you know what that means. The Stations of the Cross, when Jesus was being crucified and making that walk, align the walls. They used to walk us by the Stations of the Cross and just have us look at each one. And I would just burst into tears. It's like a little kid crying in the middle of a chapel. I got just so filled up. And I remember as an older, like my 20s, when I used to travel a lot, I always visited cathedrals and churches. And I would just feel this awe, this thing come over me. And probably my best cathedral was the woods. There was a place when I was living in Boston, in Jamaica Plain, called the Arboretum, which is like this oasis in the middle of Boston. And there was an area that I discovered with my dog that you had to crawl under a bush. Of course, and how I discovered it was because my dog crawled under the bush and I went after him. And there was these really, really tall pine trees, but in the middle was a circle. And it was empty. And I used to sit in the middle of that circle surrounded by pine trees in the Arboretum and basically commune with God. That's what I would call going to church for me. That was the way I took it. So I started with what's called religion, Catholicism, something that's very regulated and structured. But for me, spirituality isn't about what religion you have. For me, spirituality is however you see your connection to the divine or something beyond what we see or what we actually know with our minds. And that's where the role of faith comes in. Because if you don't have faith that there is something beyond, I don't think you can actually say you have a spiritual life, at least not for me. And where you find that feeling of just awe and wonder, everyone's different, but for me, it's definitely nature. It's places in nature, which is why I walk the cliffs every morning. It's kind of like my daily prayer or my daily meditation.
Mm-hmm. So that really is a spiritual practice for you, isn't it? Walking those cliffs.
It really is. It grounds me. And when I don't start my day like that, something feels off. And I think it's so hard. I have the luxury I've created a design of my life to be able to do that. Years before, when I have many more responsibilities, and for many people, they can't go walking 45 minutes on the beach or somewhere like that. But I think spirituality and spiritual practices don't have to be, go spend a month in the ashram. They can be these tiny moments that you can incorporate in your life. So for me, spirituality is much bigger than what traditional religion offers, where you go to church on Sunday, but what do you do the rest of the week? Or you go to temple, or you go wherever. So I think that's where I started. And that is why when the shaman offered me this really compelling way of entering into a deeper spiritual life and being able to marry it with the secular, it was exactly what my quest had been all my life. It's how do I merge the sacred and the secular? And he was saying, let me teach you how. And that was just too compelling for me. It's like, I don't know how he knew that, but it was the thing that I had been questing for my whole life.
Do you feel that that quest is resolved, achieved, whatever the definition of the end of a quest is? Do you feel that you're there?
I think it's a yes and a no. Yes, and the fact that I now have the tools, the understanding and the wisdom to be able to do that, to have a secular life and bring everything sacred into it. So in that sense, yes, I have that. And the no part is that I don't think it ever stops. I think it's a lifelong process. It's what drives the life force around us. It's all around us. So I don't see that it's a finite, there's an end to it. I think it's literally a practice to say, okay, I understand this idea around bringing the sacred into the secular, bringing it into my daily life. And I have to practice doing certain things. And for me, one of them is the walk on the cliffs, and there are others. And I have to practice to maintain that connection to spirit, the creator, God, your soul, universe, whatever you call it. And that's a much larger thing than what I believe religion allows us to do, because we are compartmentalized. Are you Buddhist? Are you Catholic? Are you Jewish? Are you this? Are you that? I think that we're all spiritual beings having a human experience. So I don't really adhere to any religion anymore, but I find myself defining myself as very spiritual.
I think that's really interesting what you say about with religion. I feel like there's this element of, if you pick a religion, right, that's it for you, that you now must comply with all of the rules around that religion. And it takes away that exploration into spirituality. There is no exploring of it to do, because all of the rules are neatly there in place, and you must exist within that.
And it really limits transcendent experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. What I think is very, very interesting, and what I think you do just so beautifully in the book, is you allow us, the readers, you're actually very honest about your own spiritual journey in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one of the things for me that was so compelling, was being allowed to see your own experiences unfolding. Was that intentional, to be really open in that way? And because I think what you don't do in the book is you don't bring a ton of ego to the book. I'm not saying you don't bring any ego, that would be impossible. But I think you don't bring a lot of ego around sharing your own flaws, your own honest experience of a deepening spiritual practice. So yeah, I'm interested in how intentional that was and why.
I think when I first started writing the book, I had a sense that it had my story, my experience had everything to do with this quest I had been on, this idea of how do I marry the secular and the sacred. What I didn't understand when I started writing the book was how fundamental it would be to the book. In many ways, I often say the book wrote itself, which is why I set it aside when I first started it, because I knew it wasn't ready to be written and I wasn't the writer to write it. I intuitively knew that I hadn't lived the story yet. I just knew that there was a story coming. And so I had to set aside the book. And then it was the kind of thing where as I'm writing, I'm understanding the story at a deeper level. I know that sounds weird because it's my story and you would think I would understand it before I wrote it. But like, I think in memoir, that happens a lot to writers, that we begin to understand our story through the writing of it and the recollection of it, and then the sharing of it. And I think all our stories have both our individual stories, also our collective stories. There are people who have undergone their own quest in their lives. Mine happens to be in the story. So once I understood that, it became a lot more intentional. And, you know, one of the things you said about egoless, I don't mind sharing that I was confused. I think a lot of people come to spirituality and they're confused because we hear all these messages and we're taught this is the way it should look. This is the way it should be. And, you know, as a kid, you don't have the wherewithal to ask the question, is that so? And so for me, sharing that story, sharing the confusion, sharing the idea that I had this longing, and that's the word I use, is like, I just had this longing for something that I couldn't quite define. And that's what that longing actually brought me to him and to Ecuador, because he said, I understand that longing. I've lived that longing and I've resolved that longing and I can help you do that too. You know, when people look at my relationship with them, they go, we don't understand that. You know, here you are, an American woman, entrepreneur, powerful woman, blah, blah, and you're with this guy. And what they don't see is the underpinning of it, that it wasn't just about the relationship. It was the symbolism of that relationship. For me, it was the symbolism that this person might be someone who could guide me on that journey that I had been on and that I kept trying to find a way to continue. And I didn't have it in my current life. And what was happening was that longing was making me become more and more disillusioned with the elements in my life and all the losses that I sustained in the 7 years prior, because it was like loss upon loss upon loss. And it was that quest, that spiritual quest, that actually helped me, and my spiritual beliefs and practices that helped me deal with all those losses. And I think that's important to share, because everyone experiences loss. And what do you do with it? Where do you go with it? How do you resolve it?
How do you make sense of it?
How do you make sense of it?
I can see how it must have been almost irresistible, the pull to the shaman.
It really was.
Completely understanding on that depth, that level, it must have felt so irresistible.
I remember when I first went to Ecuador and I met him, our conversations, it was the first time that I felt completely seen. Like that part of me that I had kind of hidden away since I was a little girl. And he saw it and we would have a conversation about it and he would help me understand it. And then he showed me certain practices that I could do and I could actually feel it in my body. I could feel the energy shifting in my body. So interesting enough, when we talk about spiritual practices, I don't see a lot of people I think they talk about it in a more mental way, but it's actually an embodied feeling as well. When we are in a spiritual practice, it's not just this that's working. It's this that should be involved in the practice. I mean, I used to say when I was living on the Chesapeake Bay, instead of walking the cliffs, my spiritual practice was kayaking. And the movement of the kayak just going like this was like this rhythmic kind of movement on the waves where I would experience bliss and I would experience this like oneness with everything around me. And the Chesapeake Bay is huge. So it wasn't the ocean, but it was pretty big. And that's a spiritual practice, but it's not necessarily meditation and sitting there and saying Om all day long. You know, I'm kidding, but for those people who like we take offense, but spirituality has different forms. It depending on who you are.
But I think it's a really good point to say that because, you know, and I know that it's lighthearted when we say, you know, it's not all about the prayer hands and chanting. But I do think that for some people, and I include myself in this, spirituality was almost like a club that I wasn't allowed in.
Oh.
That's how I felt. I felt like it was for other people. And it was this kind of club that I wanted to be in, but I didn't fit in or wasn't allowed. And I felt like unless I became much more alternative kind of person that, you know, I felt like a bit of a fraud. It's really only comparatively recently that I've been able to own my own spiritual practice and speak to that and without feeling incredibly self-conscious about it.
I have a question for you, Jill. What were the messages that you got as you were growing up that caused you to feel like spirituality was an exclusive club and you didn't belong? What were those messages?
Great question. I think spirituality was just a non-thing. I've thought about this a lot, and my parents were very, what I would call transactional people. They loved me. I don't doubt that they loved me. But ours was not a home where deep conversation was had. It was all incredibly routine driven and surface level conversations. There was really no talk of emotions or feelings or anything apart from the very transactional journey through life. And so I think that's what the reason was I couldn't see myself. I didn't have any examples or experiences growing up that would allow me to feel part of that world. I now know that it was already inside me and I was already, because I was quite sensitive as a child, but there was no outlet for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really why I felt like it was a club that I wasn't entitled to be in, or I just didn't belong. I just didn't belong. And that if I talked about my spiritual practice or that kind of thing, there was the part of me that felt like people would laugh at me or raise their eyebrows and say, who is she to talk about those kind of things? That was the story that I told myself. And like I say, really comparatively recently that I haven't felt like that.
And I think that society also uses the word woo-woo and not necessarily in a good way. You know, I remember when someone said I was woo-woo and I thought, no, I'm like really practical. And why can't I be both? You know, why can't I be woo-woo? And why is woo-woo why is it used in a derogatory way? And I think the other thing about our conversations is they're conversations of exclusion. Like what you're saying, I didn't belong. That's a conversation of exclusion. And so when we have these structures and these religions, they exclude people. It's not about inclusion. It's about excluding people who don't fit that mold or that structure. Spirituality doesn't exclude anybody, no matter what.
No.
It's soul-based and it's in ourselves. So, you know, the message that you got, you didn't get any. You didn't have any frame of reference for what a spiritual life might be, which is really different than my experience. In my home, being Latina, we weren't transactional. We were highly emotional, which most Latin cultures are. But it was also my mother, especially my mother, who first understood that it was normalized in our family. And it included something that most people would call mysticism. So that's the other thing. There's this word called mysticism or mystic, which is having these kind of transcendental or extraordinary experiences that religion doesn't necessarily include, or else it defines in a very narrow way. Yet there are people all over the world who have transcendent experiences that a lot of times they're called awakenings. That is what happens. That is the point in time in their life where they are uber connected to their spiritual life and to something much greater than themselves. And that doesn't exclude anyone. It's part of us. That's why I always say we are spiritual beings having a human experience, but sometimes our human experience doesn't really support our spiritual beings.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that the book is super helpful for someone like me. I didn't have that same upbringing. So I had this very secular kind of transactional upbringing. For someone like me, it's so compelling reading the story and some of the memories of when you were young as well. I just love those parts of the book where you share so intimately your own spirituality and what it means to you is just wonderful. For your readers, how can they take what you talk about in terms of spiritual practice and what we've been talking about today? How can people embed their own spiritual practice into their lives? Because I think you made the really good point earlier. You know, you have really embedded spiritual practices that you have the privilege of being able to indulge and follow. Indulge is the wrong word, but follow daily. For people who perhaps can't, like you say, walk on the inspirational cliffs of the Algarve and have that as part of their spiritual practice, how can we get into a routine or a habit of living spiritually?
You know, I think there is one main doorway, and it's called gratitude. I think that's a huge doorway into spirituality. Because when we experience gratitude on a daily basis intentionally, then we connect to that, I'll call it longing within ourselves to belong to something greater than, human body kind of thing. And when I'm on the cliffs, I experience this immense kind of gratitude for my life. Gratitude, especially like clients that I have, are very busy. So yes, they don't have an hour or something like that. But what I tell them is, I'm going to give you a couple of practices that I share. One is, you've heard this before, it's a gratitude jar. And I often tell my client to do it as a family, not just if they have a family and they have kids, start with the kids. And just every night, before you all go to bed, or if you're alone or with your family, you write on a little piece of paper something that you're grateful for that day. And you put it in the gratitude jar. And those days where aren't going so well, pick something out of that gratitude jar and remind yourself what you have to be grateful for. Instead of looking at what you don't have, look at what you do have. And gratitude can be small things. Like, I'm grateful for my animals. Like, it's like, I love Sophie and Mr. Clutie. Mr. Clutie sometimes, I don't know.
You can't have favorites.
No, well, he's not the most affectionate cat. Let's put it that way. But he's coming along.
Yeah. You love him. He can take or leave you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, she's here. She'll feed me. And then that's it. When I have my orchids bloom, like I'm looking at my orchid right now on the table. When I have my orchids bloom, it reminds me that I need to keep blooming myself, right? These are these little moments. When I go and have lunch by myself or with Sophie at a nearby cafe, there's one that's like away from everything that I like to go to. And someone brings me a beautiful meal or a delicious cup of coffee. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that person. I'm grateful for the fact that I can have that food where so many people can't. If you're in your office, one of the clients I have is a CEO and she works in construction. When I saw her office on Zoom, it was like a construction office. And she said, I have to come up with new ideas and vision. I'm so uninspired. So her practice was she has to buy herself flowers every week and put them on her desk. That's a practice. That's not your normal suggestion, but that was her practice. That was what I said to her. I said, you're not in an inspiring environment. It doesn't really inspire much except work. And then, that kind of transactional stuff. I said, every week, buy yourself fresh flowers and put them where you can see them. And in the morning when you arrive, be with those flowers, just like appreciate them, be grateful for them, and then get on with your work. Or if you're having a difficult conversation, remember that feeling that beautiful plant or that beautiful flower elicits in you when you look at it. These are all little things that you can do. Moving your body is really important. It doesn't have to be an exercise routine. It could be at lunch, go for a 15-minute walk in the park. If there's a park nearby, but get out of the transactional environment into a place of beauty. And I think nature is the other doorway, gratitude and nature. And those are the doorways into feeling like we are truly connected to our souls or our spirits. And you could do that anywhere.
I love that, Alicia. I think this is something I really do love about you as well, is that it doesn't have to be the expected. It doesn't have to be heavy duty. We're going to be spiritual right now. It's accessible. And it's accessible. This is for everybody. Everyone can take a short walk. Everyone can get into nature somehow. Even if it's looking out of a window up at a blue sky, everyone can experience nature. And so these portals, if you like, these doors of gratitude and nature, what a brilliant gift to give everyone as the access points to their own spirituality and discovering what their own spiritual practices could look like. What a gift. It's simple. It's understandable. It's easy.
I want to share a story of a friend of mine, Michelle. Michelle is a very accomplished woman in the marine industry. She and I have been friends forever. And last year she went trekking up to base camp at Mount Everest. So she went through Nepal. And one of the things she did, because this is like her nature, she brought like lollipops. And she talked about going into Nepal and going into the village and giving the children the lollipops and how they were just so excited and so grateful. What I asked her was, but how did it make you feel? And she's like, it just filled me up. So that kind of like thoughtfulness isn't just the kindness that you share with someone else. It's like a boomerang effect. It comes back to you. And she said these kids have, there's a lot of poverty in the area, but these were the happiest people I've ever seen in my life. And that's the reflection that comes back to us when we do acts of kindness or generosity. I think that's also based in gratitude. I have and I share a lollipop to a child, and it just totally makes their day, and the whole village lights up and she lights up. So we can all do that. And especially in a world that's going so fast and feels sometimes like we're lonely and we're disconnected from each other, let alone from ourselves. This is a way to connect. And they're not extraordinary, big, huge events, the tiny moments that you can incorporate in your life with intention and a sense of gratitude and love and kindness and generosity. And that brings us so much more closer to our soul self, our true nature.
Brings us so much closer to our soul self, our true nature. I love that. Oh my goodness. And it's so true. Alicia, is there anything that we haven't covered today? I mean, there's a lot we haven't covered today because spirituality is a huge topic. We could have a complete series about that. But I'm just thinking in terms of The Shaman's Wife and the book, is there anything else that you could share with us now around that connection?
Yeah, we talked in a previous episode where I shared some shamanic principles. I think that was, I can't remember which episode that was.
Yeah, I think that was last week's episode.
Yeah. I think it was last week. A lot of those principles apply to your spiritual life, like the idea of universal movement, where everything is alive when it's in movement. That was one of them. The idea of balancing light and dark, the shamanic principles that I shared in that episode are also part of a spiritual life. And it's the way we engage our life. It's not spirituality like a concept or a thing. It's actually an approach to life, a way that we choose to engage in life that will either support a spiritual life, a connection, or not. One of the things in the book that you'll read is a conversation I had with Napo, where he said he didn't want to go to the United States because they had spiritual Alzheimer's. That was his word. Spiritual Alzheimer's, where they could not remember their connection to the divine. There's a whole chapter on what that means from his perspective as a shaman and what it meant for me as someone who was becoming more involved in or engaged in my own shamanic wisdom and my own spiritual life. It's a really good chapter on understanding spirituality from a point of view of what does he mean by spiritual Alzheimer's and how do we recover? I remember he said, you have to know your own spiritual life. You can't have spiritual Alzheimer's because of the work you do. You have to recover your own first before you help anyone else.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that was powerful. Spiritual Alzheimer's, gosh, I mean, what a brilliant metaphor that is, actually. And the ironic thing is, it's a forgetting, because this isn't discovery, is it? This is already there.
Yeah.
For all of us. I believe that my spirituality is the core of my existence.
Me too. He would say that people were disconnected from the creator.
Yeah. Thank you, Alicia. This has been a really, really enlightening episode. I've really enjoyed this episode. And I think part of that is what I shared earlier about, for me, this isn't something that I've felt has been in my life. I think I had spiritual Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
I know now that it was there, but I, on some level, had forgotten. Yeah, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. May I add one more thing? It's like for anyone who's listening to this, I hope that this conversation has opened your attitude and your approach to your life and to your own spirituality. It doesn't have to be confined and limited in the ways that maybe you were taught. It's available for you. And those are the doorways, the gratitude and, reconnecting to that longing that you have inside and nature and those moments in life that you can incorporate no matter how busy you are. I always say the illusion of separateness is the cause of all hate and divisiveness in the world. And that connection, that illusion that we're separate and lack of connection is what keeps us from, love. And I would say divine love or spirit or soul or God, whatever you want. And so that connection to all and going through those doorways like gratitude, like nature, is the way that we reconnect.
Mm. What a wonderful way to end that episode. Thank you so much. Next week, we'll record our last recorded episode anyway for the podcast. And we're going to be talking about forgiveness. So I think this is going to be a really interesting one too. But for today, thank you so much.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and that getting our heads together this week has filled your mind with what's possible. If you love the show, would you do me a massive favour, please? Would you leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts? It would really help me put more heads together, reach more ears and expand more minds. Until next week, bye for now.